Hello, my name is Tiffany Nguyen, and this is my presentation on an analysis of Poem on Returning to Dwell in the Country by Tao Qian. Before we go ahead and start looking at the poem, I should go ahead and describe Tao Qian's life. Tao Qian was born in 365 AD. He passed away in 427 AD. Tao Qian was born into a family that was poor, but they were also powerful Chinese government officials. Later in his life, he would follow his family's career path and would eventually do service to the Chinese government. Eventually, he quit and retired though because he felt as though the work wasn't fulfilling to him. In his mid-30s, he left his job and retired to a farm in the middle of nowhere in rural China. When Tao Qian was elderly, he decided to write poetry. He took inspiration from the nature and minimalistic lifestyle that surrounded him. He was at peace in the countryside. The main focus of his poetry was appreciating the alluring nature of the landscapes and scenery surrounding him. Tao Qian wrote his poetry about things he loved. The main things that he loved were farming, spending time with family, and writing poetry. So let's go ahead and talk about his poetry itself. Tao Qian is an old-style Shi poet. A Shi poem is a classical Chinese poem where each verse has the same number of syllables, words, and characters. Tao Qian's poetry was very minimalistic and his words were direct. Unfortunately, though, the thoughtfully handcrafted structure of his poetry was not preserved. Not all lines in the English translation have the same number of syllables, words, and characters like it previously did in the Chinese translation. The reason why it's like this is because classical Chinese doesn't use letters. It uses characters that stand for words. I previously mentioned that he was an old-style Shi poet. Ancient Chinese poetry is divided into an old style and a new style. Old style is when the poetry is any length. Okay, so now let's start analyzing the poem. So let's look at the first two lines of the poem. When he says, "Long I have loved to stroll among the hills and marshes," he uses the word long, and it shows that he's been doing this for a long time. It reflects his retirement age and that he started writing poetry later in life. In the third verse, it says that he's holding hands with his trains of nieces and nephews. Usually holding hands is also a sign of peace, which shows that he is currently in a mood of tranquility. In the fourth line, hazel growth means that it's unkempt, which reinforces the fact that he's in the rural countryside and that they're growing crops. In line 5, it says wandering to and fro amidst, and it kind of gives off like a sort of elegant feeling, like it's not like he's stomping grouchily in the fields or anything. So he mentions dwellings of ancient men, which kind of gives like an ominous and spooky feel to it, as if something had happened beforehand. In line 7, knowing that vestiges means that something that once existed but has passed away or disappeared, it makes it seem as though things are deteriorated. Then in lines 9 and 10, he goes up to a man who's gathering wood and asks him what happened to the people that lived there. In line 12, the wood gatherer answers with a bold statement. Once they were dead, that was the end of them. It's very blunt, but true. In lines 13 and 14, the poem goes back into the perspective of Tao Qian, the main character. It shows him making the realization that even though everyone lives in one world, so many people can have differing lives. It's almost like as if Tao Qian's reflecting on his own life because he went from being a government official to just living in rural China. In lines 15 to 18, he really ponders about it. He recognizes what the gatherer said is important because he said that no, these are not empty words. They have meaning to them. They have substance. He mentions that the life of a man is like a shadow play. A shadow play stops when none of the shadows are there, which then he relates back to life. He realizes that everyone dies, death is inevitable. Once people die, they will be nothing, almost forgotten. In general, this whole poem just tells a story about how Tao Qian goes onto a stroll with his family and admires the nature side, and is then confronted with the sudden realization that death is inevitable. Now that we've gone over the poem and we understand the plot of it, let's go ahead and look into the literary elements. Okay, the first literary device is mood. Mood means like the atmosphere or like the whole vibe of the literary piece. So in the beginning of the poem, it's like a blissful mood, but then at the end, Tao Qian realizes that death is inevitable. Symbols are used to signify ideas and qualities. Their symbolic meanings are different from their literal sense. So for instance, in line 3, holding hands is often a symbol of peace. Okay, the next literary device is imagery. Imagery is when you use figurative language to represent objects, actions, and ideas in a way that can appeal to physical senses. So for lines 1 and 2, he mentions the countryside and it helps you visualize the different terrains that he's witnessing. In lines 16 and 17, he mentions a shadow play, and that can help readers imagine like a shadow play going on and then all of a sudden it stops when the shadows stop. The next literary device is speaker, and the speaker of the poem is like the voice that is telling the story. So in the story, Tao Qian is the speaker. And we know this because he uses first person pronouns all throughout the poem. And lastly is enjambment. So enjambment is when in poetry the lines move over from one line to another without like a punctuation mark or anything. So this can be found in lines 1 through 4, line 6, and line 8. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening to me speak, even though you were required to be this class. So if anyone has any questions, please ask them now.